The afternoon light was just beginning to soften when Sarah turned her patrol vehicle onto the last stretch of road before the reserve boundary. It had been a quiet shift, the kind that made you almost forget why you chose this work in the first place. The dust from the red dirt road drifted up slowly behind the car, and through the windshield the tree line stretched long and still in the fading warmth. She was thinking about getting home, about dinner, about nothing in particular. That's when she saw it. Something small was standing in the middle of the road. She eased off the gas, squinting through the dusty glass. At first she thought it was a dog, maybe a stray that had wandered out from one of the farms nearby. But as the car rolled closer, she felt a strange stillness come over her. Whatever was standing there wasn't moving away. It wasn't startled. It wasn't running. It was just standing there, waiting. She brought the vehicle to a full stop about 30 feet away and cut the engine. It was a baby gorilla, couldn't have been more than a few months old, small enough that you could have held it with both arms. Its dark eyes caught the light as it stood there in the open road, perfectly still, watching her. Sarah sat for a moment without moving, one hand still resting on the steering wheel. In all her years of rural patrol near the reserve, she had seen animals cross the road dozens of times. Impala, warthog, once, unforgettably, a young elephant that had simply walked out of the bush and stood there like it owned the road. But she had never seen anything like this. She opened the car door slowly, setting one boot down on the dirt as quietly as she could. The baby gorilla didn't flinch, didn't bolt. It watched her get out of the vehicle with those wide dark eyes, and something about its stillness sent a quiet chill across the back of her neck. She crouched down instinctively, making herself smaller, the way she'd been trained, and waited. The gorilla took a few small steps toward her, then it stopped, and made a sound she had never heard before. Soft, almost like a bird, a low breathy chirp that rose and then faded into the warm air. It wasn't a cry of distress, not exactly. It was something else, something that felt almost like a word she couldn't translate. Then the baby turned around, took 4 or 5 careful steps away from her, and looked back. Sarah stayed crouched in the road for a moment, just watching. The gorilla stood there with its small hands resting on the dirt, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. If she were being honest, and she would later tell this story many times and always pause right here, it looked like patience. Like it was waiting for her to understand something that it couldn't say out loud. She reached for her radio, called it in. Wildlife Department, unusual animal behavior, junction of Reserve Road 7. Her voice was calm the way it always was on the radio, the professional steadiness that years of patrol will give you. But even as she spoke the words, her eyes never left the gorilla, and while she waited for a response, the animal walked a few more steps in the direction of the tree line, then stopped again, looking back. The radio crackled. Wildlife response team was 20 minutes out, maybe more. 20 minutes. The baby gorilla turned again toward the forest. Sarah stood up slowly from her crouch. She told herself she was just watching, just keeping eyes on the animal until help arrived. That was the protocol. Stay with the animal, maintain visual, do not intervene. She knew the rules, but the gorilla walked to the very edge of the tree line, where the road gave way to shadow and the tall grass leaned inward over a narrow trail, and it stopped one more time. And that sound came again, that soft, low chirp, and something in the way it stood there looking back at her made her stomach tighten in a way she couldn't explain. She followed. The trail was narrow and the canopy closed quickly overhead, dropping the light to something dim and greenish. She moved carefully, watching where she placed her feet, keeping the small dark shape just ahead of her in sight. The gorilla moved with a quiet confidence, never too far ahead, never disappearing completely. Every 20 feet or so it would pause and look back, as if checking that she was still there, as if guiding her. She had been walking for maybe 4 or 5 minutes when the trees began to thin. The trail opened into a small clearing, a natural break in the forest where the light came down in long columns through the upper branches, and the ground was soft and dark. The baby gorilla moved quickly now, crossing the clearing in a straight line toward the far edge where the roots of a large tree spread wide across the ground, and then it stopped, and sat down. Sarah stepped into the clearing slowly, her eyes adjusting. She could see the gorilla clearly now, sitting very still beside something on the ground, something large. She moved closer, her boots quiet on the soft earth, and as the shape came into focus, her breath caught in her throat. An adult gorilla lay motionless against the base of the tree. Sarah went cold. She could see the trap from where she stood, the thin wire cable buried in the undergrowth, pulled tight around one leg. Whoever had set it hadn't come back for it. The injury was bad. There was no way to know how long the mother had been there. But the baby gorilla sat beside her with both small hands resting gently on her arm, pressing softly, the way a child presses against a sleeping parent, willing them to open their eyes. Sarah's hand was already reaching for her radio before she realized she was crying. She called it in. Emergency wildlife rescue. Location coordinates. Poacher trap. Adult female gorilla critically injured. Her voice broke once on the word critical, and she stopped and breathed and said it again, steadier. The baby looked up at her, then back at its mother, and that look, that small, helpless, trusting look, was the thing that undid her completely. She was still wiping her face when the sound reached her, distant at first, somewhere deeper in the trees, beyond the clearing, beyond the trail she had followed in. A low movement of branches, the crack of something heavy pressing through undergrowth. The baby gorilla heard it too. It went completely still, and turned its head toward the darkness at the far edge of the clearing, with an expression Sarah recognized immediately. Not from training, not from protocol, but from something older and more honest than either. Pure fear. Sarah didn't move. She stood at the edge of the clearing with the radio still in her hand, her eyes fixed on the tree line where the sound had come from. The baby gorilla hadn't moved either. It sat pressed against its mother's side, both small hands gripping the coarse dark fur, its body absolutely rigid. The afternoon light was thinning now, the columns of gold through the canopy turning softer and cooler, and somewhere deep in the forest that sound came again, a slow deliberate movement through heavy brush. Not an animal passing through, something that was trying to find something. Sarah lowered herself quietly into a crouch. Her radio was in her left hand and her right hand moved instinctively to her belt, not reaching for anything, just the habit of it, the muscle memory of years. She pressed the radio close to her chest and spoke in a near whisper, giving her coordinates again, adding one word she hadn't used the first time. Poachers. Possible return. The response came back low and clipped. Team was 12 minutes out. She was told to hold position and avoid confrontation. 12 minutes. She looked at the baby gorilla. It was still watching the tree line, its small chest rising and falling quickly now, those dark eyes scanning the shadows with a focus that made her chest ache. It knew. Whatever instinct lives inside a young animal that has already learned what danger smells like. It knew. Sarah moved slowly to the base of the tree, positioning herself between the mother gorilla and the direction of the sound. She crouched there in the roots, making herself as still as she could, and waited. The minutes passed like something physical. At one point the sounds stopped entirely, and the silence that replaced them was somehow worse, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, packed tight with something you can't see yet. A single bird called once from high in the canopy, and then went quiet. The baby gorilla pressed itself harder against its mother's side without making a sound. Then, nothing. The brush settled. The forest breathed again. Whatever had been moving out there either turned back or chose a different direction, because the sounds faded slowly and did not return. Sarah stayed crouched for another full minute after the last of it disappeared before she let herself exhale. She looked down at the mother gorilla. Up close, the injury was worse than she had first understood. The wire trap had caught the left leg just above the ankle, the kind of snare set low to the ground, hidden under a thin layer of leaves and soft soil, designed to hold whatever stepped into it until someone came back to collect. Whoever had set it was poaching inside the reserve boundary, which meant they knew the land well enough to move through it quietly. The mother had likely been caught the night before, maybe longer. She had fought the trap hard. The ground around her was torn up, the roots disturbed, the bark of the tree behind her scarred where she had pulled against the wire in the dark. And then at some point she had stopped fighting, had simply lain down, and the baby had stayed with her. Sarah thought about that as she crouched there waiting, about the baby gorilla standing alone in the road, about the fact that it had waited, not just stumbled into the open, not just wandered in fear, but waited, for a car, for a person, for someone to stop. She didn't know how long it had been out there before she came along. She didn't let herself think too hard about what would have happened if she hadn't. The wildlife rescue team arrived in 2 vehicles, moving fast down the trail with equipment and a field veterinarian named Dr. Amara, who had the kind of quiet, unhurried efficiency that only comes from having done this many times in difficult places. She assessed the mother quickly, her hands moving with careful certainty, and her face gave away very little. But Sarah watched her eyes and understood that the situation was serious, in a way that went beyond the visible injury. The baby gorilla did not make it easy. From the moment the team entered the clearing, it had pressed itself against its mother and refused to move. Dr. Amara's assistant approached once, gently, with a calm voice and open hands, and the baby screamed, a sound so sudden and raw and heartbroken that everyone in the clearing stopped what they were doing. It gripped its mother's fur with both hands and buried its face and screamed again, and the sound of it moved through Sarah like something physical. Dr. Amara looked across at Sarah. "It knows you," she said simply. Sarah didn't fully understand what that meant until she walked slowly toward the baby and crouched down and held out her hand, palm up, fingers loose, the way you offer your hand to any frightened creature, and the baby gorilla went quiet. It looked at her hand, then at her face, then it reached out and wrapped both small hands around her fingers and held on. She stayed like that for a long time. The team worked around her, careful and methodical, and Sarah stayed crouched at the mother's side with the baby holding her hand, and she talked, not to anyone in particular, just low and quiet into the air, about nothing important. The drive-in, the color of the light earlier, small ordinary things. She didn't know if it helped, but the baby stayed calm as long as she kept talking, and so she kept talking. Dr. Amara worked on the mother for over an hour. The wire had done deep damage. There was blood loss, infection already beginning, and the stress of the ordeal had weakened her in ways the veterinarian was cataloging with a focused clinical expression that told Sarah more than any words could. At one point, Dr. Amara sat back on her heels and was still for a moment, looking at the mother gorilla, and Sarah saw something pass across her face, not hopelessness exactly, but the look of someone quietly recalibrating what they were hoping for. The mother was still breathing. That was what they held on to as the light finally left the clearing, and the team set up portable lanterns that cast the forest in a warm, trembling white. Still breathing, still here. The baby had moved from Sarah's hand to her lap somewhere in the middle of all of it, curled there with one arm wrapped around her knee, watching its mother with a steady, exhausted attention that broke something open in Sarah she hadn't known was closed. One of the younger team members, a man named Joseph who couldn't have been more than 25, crouched beside Sarah at one point and looked at the baby and then at her and said quietly, "I've never seen one do that before. Choose a person like that." Sarah didn't answer. She just looked down at the small dark shape curled in her lap, at the tiny hand still loosely holding the hem of her uniform jacket, and she thought about the road. About the moment she had stepped out of the car and crouched in the dust and the baby had made that soft, strange sound and looked back at her. She thought about how easy it would have been not to follow. The mother gorilla's breathing was shallow now, and slower than it had been an hour ago, and Dr. Amara had stopped making adjustments and was simply sitting beside her in the lantern light with one hand resting gently on the animal's side. The team had gone quiet. The forest had gone quiet, and in that quiet the baby lifted its head from Sarah's lap and looked at its mother, and made that sound again, that soft, low chirp, just once, like a question it already knew the answer to. The mother gorilla died just before midnight. There was no dramatic moment, no final struggle. Her breathing had been growing slower and further apart for the last hour, each exhale a little longer than the one before it, until somewhere in the space between one breath and the next one simply didn't come. Dr. Amara's hand was still resting on her side when it happened. She felt it before anyone else knew. The stillness that is different from sleep, the kind that has no morning on the other side of it. She didn't say anything right away. She just closed her eyes for a moment and kept her hand where it was. Sarah knew. She knew before Dr. Amara looked up. She knew from the way the forest seemed to hold itself differently in that moment. The way the lantern light felt suddenly too bright for what the clearing had become. She was still sitting on the ground with the baby in her lap, and she felt the small body tense, felt it the way you feel a change in weather, something animal and wordless, and she tightened her arms around it instinctively without thinking. The baby gorilla went completely still. It didn't scream, it didn't thrash, it just stopped moving and sat there in her arms with its eyes fixed on its mother, and that stillness was somehow the hardest thing Sarah had ever witnessed. She had seen grief before, in people, in families, in the long quiet aftermath of things that couldn't be undone. But she had never felt it come off a living creature the way it came off that small animal in her arms, like heat from something that had been burning a long time. Dr. Amara finally looked up. Her eyes moved to Sarah and then to the baby, and she gave a single slow nod that said everything it needed to say without a word. Joseph, sitting a few feet away with his elbows on his knees, dropped his head and stared at the ground. One of the other team members turned away from the lantern light and stood at the edge of the clearing with her back to everyone, her shoulders tight. No one spoke for a long time. Sarah sat in the dirt with the baby gorilla in her arms and her back against the roots of the old tree, and she didn't try to stop crying. There was no point. The tears came the way they come when something true and heavy moves through you, and there's no dignified way to carry it. Slowly at first, and then all at once, and then quietly, the way rain settles after a storm. She held the baby tighter, and rested her chin on the top of its small head, and she just let it happen. The baby reached up with one hand, not grabbing, just reaching, the way very young creatures reach, slowly and without certainty, testing whether something is real. Its small fingers found Sarah's forearm, and rested there, barely any weight at all, and she felt that touch move through her like a current. She pressed her lips together, and breathed and looked up at the dark canopy above them, where the lantern light barely reached, where the tops of the trees disappeared into black. Dr. Amara came and crouched beside her after a while. She spoke in a low voice, practical and kind at the same time, the way people who deal in difficult realities learn to speak. She explained what would need to happen, that the baby would need to go into wildlife rehabilitation care, that there were protocols, that it was young enough to have a real chance if the transition was handled carefully. She said all of it gently, and Sarah heard all of it, and nodded at the right moments, but she didn't let go. Not yet. She stayed there for another hour while the team worked quietly around her, documenting and preparing, moving with the respectful efficiency of people who understood that some moments need space even when there is work to be done. And she talked to the baby the whole time, still low, still quiet, the same way she had been talking all evening. She told it that it had been so brave, that what it had done, standing in that road, waiting, leading her back through the trees, was the bravest thing she had ever seen. She knew it couldn't understand the words. She said them anyway, because some things need to be said out loud even when the only witness is the dark. At some point the baby gorilla shifted in her arms and looked up at her, not the wide scanning look of a frightened animal checking for danger, something slower than that, something that moved from her chin to her eyes and stayed there, steady and direct, the way very few creatures, human or otherwise, will actually look at you. Sarah looked back. She didn't look away, and in that moment she made a promise. She didn't announce it. She didn't say it out loud the way promises get made in stories, with weight and ceremony and witnesses. She just said it quietly, almost under her breath, to the small dark eyes looking up at her in the lantern light. "I've got you. You hear me? I've got you." The baby blinked and looked back at its mother one last time. Then it turned away and tucked its head beneath Sarah's chin and was still. The transfer happened in the early hours of the morning. Dr. Amara had arranged for the baby to go to a wildlife rehabilitation center about 2 hours from the reserve, a facility that specialized in great apes, run by people who had spent their careers learning how to help young animals survive the unsurvivable. Sarah carried the baby to the vehicle herself. It had fallen into something between sleep and exhaustion somewhere around 2 in the morning, and it lay against her shoulder with the limp, absolute trust of a creature that has simply run out of the energy required for fear. She placed it carefully in the padded transport crate. It stirred when she pulled her hands away. Its eyes opened, just barely, half-focused and slow, and it looked at her the way you look at something you're not sure will still be there when you wake up. She pressed her fingers gently against the mesh of the crate. The baby reached out and touched them. "I'll come find you," she said. "I promise." She stood in the dark clearing for a long time after the vehicle pulled away, listening to the forest settle back into itself around her. The lanterns had been packed up. The team had gone. It was just her and the trees and the place where something had ended and something else, fragile and uncertain and alive, had just begun. She walked back out to the road alone. The stars were very bright, and somewhere out in the dark, past the tree line and the long silence, a night bird called once, low and clear, and then was quiet. The rehabilitation center sat at the end of a long gravel road lined with acacia trees, and the first time Sarah drove it she counted them without meaning to, 17 trees between the gate and the main building, their flat tops catching the early morning light like open hands. She had taken 3 days off after the night in the forest, not because anyone told her to, because she had come home that morning and sat down at her kitchen table and found she couldn't quite remember how ordinary things worked for a while. The kettle, the chair, the simple mechanics of a regular day. She sat there until the sun moved all the way across the floor, and then she went to bed and slept for 14 hours, and when she woke up the first thing she thought about was the baby. She called Dr. Amara before breakfast. The baby was stable, eating, not well, not enthusiastically, but eating. It had spent the first 2 days refusing food and sitting in the corner of its enclosure facing the wall, which the staff said was normal, expected. The word they used was grieving, and they used it plainly and without apology, the way people use it when they have watched enough animals to know that the feeling is not uniquely human. It was grieving, and it was alive. Sarah was on the road within the hour. She didn't know what she expected when she walked into the enclosure area that first visit. She had told herself she was just checking, just following through, that she would see the baby was in good hands and leave feeling settled, and that would be the end of it. She had told herself that story the whole drive there, and she almost believed it. The baby was sitting with a care worker named Nadia, a quiet, steady woman in her 30s, who had a gift for sitting close to frightened animals without making them feel crowded. The baby was not quite leaning against her but was near enough to feel her warmth, picking at a piece of fruit with the mechanical disinterest of something going through the motions of living. Sarah stopped at the enclosure entrance. The baby looked up, and for one moment it was completely still. The same stillness it had in the road that first afternoon, that particular quality of absolute attention that had stopped Sarah's car and changed everything. Then it stood up, dropped the fruit, crossed the enclosure floor in a straight, unhesitating line, and pressed both hands flat against the mesh between them. Sarah crouched down. She pressed her fingers against its fingers through the mesh and didn't say anything for a long moment. Her throat had closed in that way it does when the thing you're feeling is too large for words, and trying to speak through it only makes it worse. The baby made a soft sound, not the chirping call from the forest, something quieter, something that seemed to come from lower down, from somewhere deep in its small chest. Nadia watched from across the enclosure with the expression of someone witnessing something she recognized but rarely saw. "It hasn't done that for anyone else," she said quietly. "Not since it came in." Sarah came back the following week, and the week after that. She worked it around her shifts the way you work the things around that matter to you, without advertising how much they matter. Early mornings when she could manage them. Long drives on days off. She brought nothing. No food, no toys, nothing that would make the visits feel transactional. She just came and sat, and let the baby set the terms of every visit, the way the center's protocol required, and the way her instincts would have told her to anyway. The baby grew. Not quickly. Great apes carry their childhood long and slowly, which is part of what makes them who they are, but steadily. Weeks became months, and the small creature that had curled exhausted against her shoulder in the dark became something more confident, more curious, more fully itself. It learned the rhythms of the center. It formed cautious relationships with the other staff. It began to play, tentatively at first, and then with the kind of full-bodied, unself-conscious joy that is one of the most quietly moving things you can watch in a young animal, because it means that something that was broken has begun, improbably, to heal. But when Sarah came, it was different. Everyone on the staff noticed it. The way the gorilla's whole body changed when it heard her car on the gravel. The way it moved to the nearest point of whatever enclosure it was in, and waited, watching the path from the parking area with a focused patience that looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like someone watching for a person they loved. Because that is what it was. That is exactly what it was, and the staff at the center had long since stopped trying to describe it in more clinical language, because the clinical language kept falling short. 3 years passed. Sarah was promoted. She moved to a different patrol district, further from the reserve, and the drive to the center got longer. She made it anyway, rearranged things, found the time the way you find time for the things that have become part of who you are. The gorilla was adolescent now, larger and stronger and unmistakably itself, with a personality that the staff described as watchful and gentle, with a dry kind of humor that expressed itself through the particular way it would steal small objects and then sit with them, examining them with exaggerated seriousness while the humans pretended to be more upset than they were. It was doing well. Better than well. But the moment Sarah's car came down that long gravel road, past the 17 acacia trees whose number she still knew without counting, the gorilla always knew. Before she parked, before she got out, before she was visible from any angle that should have allowed recognition, it knew. The staff had a few theories. Scent, most likely carried ahead on the wind, the particular sound of her engine, the accumulated memory of hundreds of arrivals stored somewhere in a body that had learned, against considerable odds, that she always came back. The theories were probably right. Science is usually right about the mechanisms of things, but Sarah never spent much time on the theories. She would park and get out and walk the familiar path, and the gorilla would be at the nearest point of the enclosure waiting for her, and she would crouch down the way she had crouched in a dirt road on a quiet afternoon years ago, and it would press its hands against the mesh, and she would press hers back, and for a moment the whole long, complicated distance between that night in the forest and this ordinary morning would collapse into something very small and very clear. A promise made in the dark, kept in the light. She thought about the mother sometimes. More than sometimes. She thought about her on the drive-in, in the quiet stretch between the last town and the gravel road, when the landscape opened up and the sky got wide. She thought about what that gorilla had given, not just her life, in the way that all lives end, but the particular courage of lying down in the dark, and trusting that the small frightened creature beside her would find a way to bring help. Whether that trust was conscious, whether it rose to anything like intention, Sarah couldn't say. She was a police officer, not a scientist, but she had been a human being long enough to know that trust doesn't always need language to be real. The baby had stood in the road, it had waited, it had led her back through the trees, and something that had seemed like instinct or accident or the random collision of an ordinary afternoon with an extraordinary moment had turned out to be the beginning of something that was still going, still true, still present every time she made the turn onto that gravel road and the acacia trees began to pass on either side of her like a count. She knew by heart. 17 trees, the building at the end, and waiting there, larger now, older, carrying its own history in the quiet way that animals carry things, without drama or narrative, just presence, the one that had found her first. She always parked in the same spot, she always walked the same path, and it was always there.